Our next journey is in War and Peace. This is the, well, not the newest edition. This is the re-release. I think it's the first of the re-releases. So it would be the second edition of the game, essentially. But unfortunately, I think it's up to like edition 7 now. Now, as a comparison, I've got the components of this thing set up here, and I'm going to start with the Italian campaign of 1796, 1797. Unfortunately, the setup for that contains pieces that aren't in the game, like leaders who are neither in the counter mix nor here. Maybe things have been corrected since then. The introductory scenario, which I'm not playing, I'm playing the more advanced one, starts with 2 units set up in the same hex, which doesn't even make sense. Basically, Austrians and French there. I just want to point this out because I have, I'm not going to go through a setup woes of this whole thing. But for comparison, I have the old War and Peace over here. And you can see, I mean, I well love this game. This was one of my go-tos for a long time until I ran into Empires in Arms, which is kind of hiding there in the dark. And fell in love with Empires in Arms and with its better, like, its grand campaign that felt like you actually could try to play the different countries without being forced into a historical roles. Now, if you want to win the game, maybe not. And there's weird shit that happens in that game. To the extent that I started when I was playing Empires in Arms, or after I had played it a few times, some of them, you know, big opposed games, full set and whatever, at least for some time until people started dropping out. I started to think, wow, there's something really wrong with this. But the biggest thing was I liked the operational combat that War and Peace devises. I like the piece structure, the formalized pieces that Empires in Arms had. So anyway, as soon as there was a re-release of this, I said, damn, I won. You know, I definitely want to take a look at playing this. Well, I tackled the rules a while ago, quite a while ago, like maybe a couple of years ago, and felt like the core rules were basically the same. Now this time I've reread them, and I'm not so convinced of that, which is one reason I have the original rules here, because every now and then I may want to check the original just to, you know, see if my memory is correct. In at least one case, I'm looking over something in the Grand Campaign and I'm like, huh, I think I modified that or cheated or something. I don't know which. But I kind of gave up after hitting 2 stymies. One is the victory conditions, I don't have it up here, on the Grand Campaign scenario. Currently I'm reading your Grand Campaign scenario. I've got to get through the naval rules for that before I get to the Egyptian campaign. But also, this little thing, which is a description of how to operate your forces effectively, doesn't seem to apply, doesn't seem to be about these rules. It's surely not about those rules. It feels almost as if it was designed and written for some rules that aren't quite these, and maybe they're in one of the later editions. I don't know. Like I said, I think it's up to like edition 7 now. This was put out by One Small Step. I learned a lesson. If they ever re-release something that's gonna, or if they ever release something that I know is gonna be popular, I will not buy it until a later edition. because there are definitely problems with this. I don't know if they just corrected a few little problems or if they changed some stuff. Let's go over what you got. You got the campaign. So you got the base rule book here, glossy, unfortunately. Looks a lot like the original in terms of the structuring, not normal Avalon Hill structuring. If you look in here, not normal Avalon Hill structuring. Now these suckers go out to like Y. Yeah, they do here too. Okay, I didn't think they went that far. What else do you have? Well, the board, obviously, and look at the difference of the boards. I have such a love of the memories of playing this thing that it's really hard for me to diss on this board. But all this color and everything is definitely attractive. I think it distracts, though, from the information the game is providing. I know I'm looking at this and saying, oh my God, what a confusing mess, compared to the clarity and cleanliness that this provided. And I don't remember ever saying, geez, I wish there was more color on the board. As a gameplay thing, I don't feel like that's of much value. There are some things that are useful, these little port boxes maybe. It extends the space. There's no question of that. I don't know if you go further into Russia. See, this is tilted in a kind of nice way that gets all the important areas of the campaign, or of the campaign area for 1805 to 1815 in play. This one adds the Kingdom of Naples, which you got a teeny bit of it in there. I think there's a little bit more of England in there. But the most important thing is that it adds this little insert for global operations, which I don't remember a damn thing about. They weren't in the original at all. And the Egyptian campaign. Speaking of the Egyptian campaign, you have Turkish units in this game. Where are they? They're over here, which I think are only used for that. The game does not have a 6-player version, so you've got the same 5 powers in the Grand Campaign. This is kind of disappointing to me. I feel like I would have rather had Turkey as a power, just like it is in Empires in Arms, Empires in Arms is 7, isn't it? Doesn't make sense, wait. Spain, England, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia. That's 6 powers, right? This game only holds 5 in the Grand Campaign. I'm a little confused by that. At least, maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I certainly was reading it and I'm like, it only holds 5. It only holds 5. Pretty sure the Grand Campaign in this held 6, but I'm having trouble finding the players. Anyway, this looks like it was, so even though Mark McLaughlin is prominently featured on it, it feels like a lot of the work maybe was added by, I don't know if I have it here. It's somewhere. Here we go. This John W. Gant. So you see game development project manager, editor, but also historical research and design. He's doubled in there. That worries me quite a bit. It makes me feel like there wasn't an actual developer that Gant just took it on as maybe not as a solo project. I'm sure he passed things by and knocked ideas around with McLaughlin, but that he took the lead on trying to modify the game. Now, the original War and Peace had a serious problem with it, which was the Grand Campaign just didn't work. I see in terms of victory conditions for the multiplayer game. It had a weird functionality in it. And we'll get into more of that when we talk about the Grand Campaign for this. I'm not sure this is going to be better. But it sure is going out of its way to try to do something that generates a more historical feel with a lot of overhead in it that feels kind of uncomfortable and not very smooth. Like the victory conditions are really, really convoluted. They're basically trying to reproduce the historical situation, and it feels almost scripted in terms of that. So what do you have other than the board? Well, you have this force pool display where you keep, in the Grand Campaign, you keep strength points in there. You're not going to be able to build infinitely the way you are in, say, Empires in Arms. It was the same as the old War and Peace, by the way. Everything's pretty much the same in terms of general base structure. But Empires in Arms had its own limitation, which was the manpower production. But you could basically build up over a long period of time a really huge army. And at the same time generate, if you were a weaker power, generate a lot of victory points if you could stay at peace. You had all kind of information here, year record track, month record track, production, where you keep track of, again, this is all Grand Campaign stuff. These combat boxes, I guess, are just, a simplification because you're going to have combat counters in the game, and I don't know, there aren't enough boxes for all the counters, but I'm okay with that. Weather, which was not, if I recall, a part of the game, and it's by zones. Specific foreign wars that can occur. This is something the original had, which was the USA War of 1812, wars with Turkey, between Russia and Turkey, and now something new, a Swedish war, which is interesting because that's something that wasn't in the original. The alliance display, where you keep track of which powers are aligned with either the pro or anti-French. You basically have two sides to the game, pro and anti-French, and you could be neutral. But this also tracks city points, which is cities you've captured on your enemy, and victory points that have been collected, which may not matter in the Grand Campaign, although it may with regard to the diplomacy. But if you're playing the full game, with a full number of players, you wouldn't have that. Naval economic warfare, this is new stuff to me. It's going to be in the campaign game. I don't know it yet. What else do we have? We have these alliance leaders displays, well, for the French and for the non-French. And unlike, see, the original had this all integrated on one display, which worked okay for, storing pieces on it. It's still kind of a pain in the ass. But what it didn't work well for was if you wanted to use the hidden movement rules, you basically would have to make up additional sheets so that each player had their own, like they do here. So this supports the fog of war rules that the game has as an option. Like I said, the base rule book, scenarios. There's a bunch of scenarios here. There's the Grand Campaign, that's downstairs. But here we got a list of all the different scenarios that are in here. And they kind of suggest going with the Italian campaign as the first one. And luckily, although I suspect that the Marengo one is actually easier, this is perfectly fine. For the counters, Leaders have a single value on them. That's going to be their combat capability, but it also affects attrition, I believe. And lots of zeros. And actual units, I found these kind of painful. They're not too bad here, but so you have a letter to tell you what type of unit it is, and a picture. And so like Cav has a C. Well, Guard Cav has a GC on it. Cossack Cav has a CC. Those look surprisingly similar. I want to compare these counters to the originals because I was having a great deal of trouble seeing what was on these counters. I find these so much more readable than the counters that the new edition has. The counters that the new edition has are glossy, shiny. They have maybe too much information on them, and they're not using information the way the original did. The original used some really nice information in the sense that if you had white print on, basically the print that you had on the counter told you a bunch of stuff. It told you the morale of the unit. It told you which nationality it was, whether it was the core nationality or a minor. That's not really present now. In order to determine the nationality for a unit, you have a few options. Let's take a look, because this is really a grump factor for me. Here's a Portuguese unit compared to a British unit. Now, the difference here is the Portuguese unit has a tiny PT on it. I can barely read these, and in some cases, they're hard to distinguish between each other. What can you use to distinguish? This is reminding me of that horrible thing I played recently, what the fuck is it? The Valmy to Waterloo, but Nations in Arms. The way the counter design was done in that, where there was so much busyness on the counters you could barely see anything. The other thing beyond that tiny little PT there, and in the original game you would have had a rather large PT taking up the space that the PT and the I take up here. Do you really need an I to tell you that it's infantry? Well, maybe, because there's also militia, and they're not color-coded to be differentiated. Although in the original game, the militia wouldn't necessarily be color-coded. You might have militia or partisans or whatever. They'd have a letter there, but they'd also be clearly part of that nationality because they'd be white print on instead of black print and stuff like that. So the other option you have to try to figure out whose is by looking at the little flag in the corner here. Yeah, again, not really easy, because there's so much information packed into this counter and this stupid graphic that's prettier and whatnot. Maybe. How much do you really look at your graphics on your counters when they're this small? I don't know. But my eyes have gotten worse, and the representation has gotten more difficult to view. I kind of don't like where gaming is going in terms of that. And I'm saddened, to think that, hey, maybe I'd have been better off just keeping the original. Yeah, except it's on. It would be a lot of work to fix the campaign game. They did a lot of work here. What about informational counters and whatnot? Outside of the player counters. Okay, we got a bunch of stuff here. These are various informational counters about points that different nations have, etc. These are alliance counters. Control markers here. You didn't need control markers in the original. Not sure how much you need them here. We have the weather. There's some game turn markers. Interestingly, in the scenario, I couldn't find the game start or end. Try to figure that out. Some things that look like little event markers. Now, one is Napoleon in exile. Some of these others, These are counters I didn't know what to do with from what I've read so far. It'll be in the campaign rules. Except maybe this Spanish alliance marker. I don't know what's up with that. Is it supposed to be one of these? I don't know. These are chit selection for combat tactics. This was in the original, a la 1776's chit selection. It gives you a modifier on the combat table. It's an it's an option. You don't have to play it. All it is a modifier. It's not like Empires and Arms, where if you don't play with the chit selection, you're fucked completely. 1776, I think you're required to use them, but you might not if you chose not to. Got little markers for each battle. A couple of them match those battle boxes. Others don't. What is this? Some kind of demoralized. Unsupplied markers. Are those that important? Not really. You only really worry about supply, I think, for attrition and for launching attacks. Both of which kind of happen on your turn, and you determine your supply beforehand. So it's not that big a deal. These are demoralization counters. They're used in combat. This is all in the original game. Trenches were in the original game. Forts were not, and I haven't seen any rules about them in the base rules. Maybe they show up somewhere else. Maybe they show up, I don't know, in scenarios or whatnot. Then these are kind of cute. We had these in the original as well. They're number markers for how long you've been besieging someone. And basically, if you besiege someone, you roll a die to try to get under that number, and then they surrender. And then, maybe the biggest thing of all, is this big old, you only have one of these. That, I think, is a negative. There should be two. Both players, in a two-player game, both players should have one. In a multiplayer game, I can understand why you don't have one per player, but let's take a look at what we got here. Well, we'll look here. So the combat result table is like the original. You figure out your odds, you roll dice, and you get what's kind of a minor result. Now, I don't remember it being... Whoa! Well, this is new. I haven't seen this. I know this. I haven't seen this yet. Sequence of play is all out here. Chronology of events for whatever that's worth. Let's keep looking. Could be a dungeon master with this. Okay. Here's what there is. So this combat loss chart, I don't remember that existing in the original. I thought the original, the number on your loss was how much you took. Here, it's compared to the strength of the force. Am I missing something? I'm missing something. Yeah, that was in the original. Okay, that was something I didn't remember, but combats generally aren't all that decisive in a single round. And you have opportunities to bring reinforcements into play in this game, but you're not in sort of a monolith. So in Empires and Arms, you have the ability to, do outflanks where troops arrive and stuff like that. But the combat is sort of a monolithic thing. And this gives more of an operational view where you can have multiple corps positioned and pushing their way into the combat. And that was the thing that I wanted, so that you could actually reflect the outflank in that way. And that you could bring reinforcing forces in and whatever. And there were advantages and interesting options based on that. That's what this little booklet tries to describe. But again, I think it I think it doesn't correspond to the actual rules. So, but that was one of the things that always hooked me on, or that got me excited about going back to War and Peace was, the Empires and Arms combats are kind of monolithic. You move into an area, because it's an area-based movement game, and you determine your strength and any modifiers you have, due to cav advantages or whatever, leadership bonuses and all. You do a chit selection, but you basically fight I think, 3 rounds of combat. It's very much like Europa Universalis. In fact, EU's combat system is designed off of the Empires in Arms one. And you're trying to wear out the opponent's morale, and if you break their morale, you beat them. If you don't, you both stay in the area. In this one, the players have continual options because of the smaller combat factors to decide to stick around, to try to reinforce, try to withdraw from a battle and reinforce into a different battle, stuff like that. So it's got much more of that kind of operational feel, and it feels like you have some sort of tactical almost aspects to how you place your units and how you utilize them. That's my hope. I'm going to need to swap batteries, and this is going to be a long video because we got to go through the whole rules too. So let's look at what else we have here. We have the tactical matrix here. Now this is weird. We have it in both places. I'm not quite sure why. This feels like an error. Although there's lots of information in this one that's not in this one. This one feels more like the one in the original, where you might have to look up situations. Forced marching is an option that you have, not an optional rule, but an option that you have to try to press your units. You might lose strength points due to it. Basically, you can't guarantee you're going to get the amount of movement that you want. I like that. I think that, oh, by the way, about the granularity of the combat in this game. One thing that worries me is, just like in Empires in Arms, they're month-long turns. It's an I go, you go system, just like Empires in Arms. And all the battles are kind of happening at the same time, which doesn't really feel right. There were very few situations. I can think of one in particular that I had here. What is it? It's one of these Ampere series, but I'm having trouble finding it. I don't know. I think it's the German battles. Probably over in this other pile over here, and too dark to see. I'm not so sure. Oh, they're down here. Yeah. Yeah, the 3 battles of in Germany, Viva the Emperor, had, I don't remember which battle, but basically the 2 battles are happening close to one another at about the same time, and they can intervene with each other. And in fact, the Waterloo campaign has the same kind of situation, but that one works a little differently. But anyway, there were very few situations where there were battles happening close to each other that happened on the same day. And I'm not, I'm not really convinced. I'm worried that the game's going to create too many of those situations due to the kind of spaced out deployment and whatnot, and forces engaging each other nearby to each other, where they can actually cause battles and then move from that battle to another battle. Essentially, they're all happening at exactly the same time, and that just doesn't feel at all appropriate. Now, of course, it's I go, you go, so the battles that France generates all happen at a different time than the battles that Austria generates. But anyway, or whatever. Whoa, is this just duplicate? No, I flipped it over already. Whoa, is the attrition, didn't I have the attrition table already? No. The attrition table, I believe the way this is done is you roll one die and all your forces based on their size take a certain amount of attrition. I think I think I either misplayed this or changed the rules on this one in the original. We'll look that up when I'm digging through the rules, where I'd roll for each stack separately. We talked about the combat results table already. Why? Okay. Yeah, we have a specific naval combat here, which again, you determine based on the smaller force here, how much damage is done. The combat results, gotta flip this whole thing to find the combat loss, and again, it's based on the smaller force. Terrain effects chart. Weather table, that's new. But there's only one of these. And that kind of grumps me. By the way, the materials on the stock, these guys, are really, really solid. They're glossy. I feel like porno glossy, actually. But anyway. So I'm going to go away for a while, play my stupid video game that I'm beginning to grow disenchanted with. And then I'll come back up and start the rules maybe. I may not get to them until Sunday. Right now it's Thursday night. I'm feeling fatigued. I've been up, I don't know, not all that long. Yeah. I don't remember when I woke up. Feels like it was before noon, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I'm also not feeling well still, so. Just about midnight now. Let's start digging into the rules and see if I'm too sick to do this. Talked about most of this. Base sequence of play. Okay. When it's your turn, the first thing that you do is an attrition phase. And you roll one die and look at the attrition table for each of the hexes that you occupy. We can actually take a look at how that works if we want. So it's based on the strength. As long as your 2 strength points or less, you won't take any attrition, which is important because your depots are basically 1 strength point units running back. Again, kind of, this was taken up in Napoleon in Arms, or Nations in Arms, but in weird sort of ways that don't work as well. Like this is just cleaner. And you roll a die. You have some modifiers. If you're in your home country, you get bonuses. Spain and Russia's bad. Winter's bad. French are good. You don't have to take the bonuses in your favor, but I can't see why you wouldn't. Maybe if you want to kill units off. The alliance phase, in most of the scenarios, it's possible to bring other nations into play. And essentially, you'll roll a die. You have modifiers based on city points, victory points, in order to see whether or not somebody joins you. So the better you're doing, the more likely they are to join you. There'll be other modifiers in place as well. In the Grand Campaign, this is used for the major powers to bring them into play. Reinforcement phase. Okay, if you have any scheduled reinforcements, you bring them in according to where they are. They're all listed in the scenario itself. In the Grand Campaign, you use production points, which are based on cities. Oh boy, this is ugly. I don't know how to read this. So I can't tell where production is intrinsically. It may be this little marker here. I'm looking for a map key and I don't see one. in, well, I cleaned it up. In the old game, there were very few things to distract you on the board, and it was very, very clear where the locations were that could produce. They had a soldier or a boat in the case of this. I think that's the situation, because this looks like the same kind of thing, and that's where the naval production was. So like Madrid is the only production city in Spain, and that's correct. Those production cities can produce regular units. There were limited use production cities. Here they are. So like Innsbruck, which has this black thing, that can only produce landfare, for what it's worth. Okay, and you'll see over here, the Egyptian insert, which isn't used in the campaign game, doesn't have any of those. They're only on the main map. Movement phase, you move your units, and honestly, it's very much just a straight I go, you go. You pay the terrain costs and move them. But you need a leader to move your units, and a leader can only command 10 units at a time. But you can move other leaders to join that leader. Then the combat phase. Okay, this is the most complicated part of the game. It is actually relatively complex for what the rest of the game is. Basically, if you're adjacent to an enemy unit, you can attack it. But you can't coordinate directly. You can only coordinate by rolling for reinforcements at the end of the round of a round of combat. And the opponent can withdraw before that, and all kind of shit like that. It's a relatively complicated combat system to give you that more tactical feel than even an operational game generally has. All right. I've pretty much talked about attrition. The alliances, each victory point, city point, and power on your side gives you a bonus on the die roll. And during the alliance phase, you have the option to roll. You don't have to roll. For example, if the dice modifiers are against you. During combat, you're given victory points for each one of your units that enter a hex that was occupied by 5 or more enemy strength points at the start of the combat phase. I'm not sure if this applies during the campaign game. I don't remember it doing so in the original, but I may have missed that. But I know it existed. The non-French player gets 2 victory points if any of his units enter a hex which was occupied by Napoleon and 5 or more strength points at the start of a combat phase. You can't get more for entering a city hex if the enemy falls into the city. You can also be given points for controlling cities, potentially. The difference in totals, I believe the maximum modifier is 4 in either direction. And you're seeking to get a 7 or a 0 based on what's going on there. Okay, I'm going to stop there because my drippies are getting too bad. It's cold, and yeah, I'm just not feeling well, and the battery's running out. Here it is, Sunday night. Apparently, I don't know, either me being sick impacted things, or more likely I had more to drink than I usually do, and it was back to like the bad old days yesterday. You know, it's not like I'm terribly affected, but the dehydration and whatnot is in place, and I just you know, don't feel up to doing anything. And then today, well, I woke up around 2, but I played my video game a great deal and whatnot. It's a rainy day, and I still have like, and this is cold related, a little bit of a headache and sinus issues and whatnot. Anyway, let's see what we can get here. Reinforcements phase, you get any reinforcements, it'll be specified by the scenario, and you might also get replacement points. In the campaign game, your reinforcements will be leaders, I think, for the most part. And replacement points are handled by your force pool. We've seen things like this before where there are force pools in the Clash of Monarchs series, for example, I think had one. Which serves as an absolute limit on what troops you can build. And it's a nice solution. I like the manpower levels in Empires and Arms as an alternative. They're okay. Ground movement. Okay. You can move your units pretty much, it's an I go, you go game, pretty much at will. The distance is their movement allowance. Yeah. Movement allowances, I don't know if they're... I think they were spelled out in the original on the charts. I don't have that open and set up properly right now. I can't remember it. I'm looking for them. There we go. It's the type. Leaders have a 10 movement point allowance, except Napoleon and Wellington, who magically are a little faster with 12. Cav have 4. Infantry don't have one. They can only move if they're commanded by a leader. And only 10 strength points can be commanded by any given leader, except, again, Napoleon and Wellington go up to 12. Once the leader has expended 3 movement points, they can't pick up more units unless those units are going to be forced marching. And infantry has to be the same color as the leader that is commanding them, which is basically a nation and its satellites. As a leader is moved, any infantry accompanying him can be dropped off. It says you may not pick up a leader once the leader has expended even a single movement point. This is weird because here they say no infantry strength points may accompany a leader after the leader has expended 3 movement points, except by forced marching. If the active player desires, he may continue moving a leader which has previously dropped off all the infantry. This is just a contradiction, and I don't know which one to deal with. Then we hit a rule here which says when Napoleon reaches Verdun, the French player, I think this is part of the example. Unlike infantry, cav can move on their own, but they could also join a leader within the limits of the cav's movement allowance, provided that the total strength points accompanying the leader doesn't exceed their limit. But there's no real reason for this. Leaders can be moved independently or accompanied by leaders. Damn glossy paper. Or infantry or cav strength points. So army groups are possible. The leaders have to pay the terrain costs. The active players' units are moved during the movement phase. No unit can enter a hex which is occupied by any of the inactive players' units except for in overruns. During movement, combat is prohibited. Oh, by the way, here's something weird in this game. They say see SG section I. What is SG? Well, it turns out it's this book. I don't know what it stands for. Maybe like standards of war in French? I don't know. It's really weird. For whatever reason, any references in this book, and it's not highlighted anywhere, and here the damn paper is coming out of the staple. Fuck. I mean, this is, barely used. I read the rules once. All right. Forced marching is possible. You can increase the mobility of cav or infantry using forced march. A leader himself can't force march. At any time during movement, you can announce the intention to attempt a forced march, and you declare that you want 1, 2, or 3 additional movement points. You indicate the path that you'll follow, and you must follow that path as well as possible. And there's a forced march table somewhere over here. You roll a die, you see how many movement points you get. You follow your path, which might mean that you can't enter a hex, but could have entered a different hex, something like that. There are modifiers to it. If you get an asterisk, you lose a strength point for forced marching. What you'll see is you can always try to force march an extra hex, but anything beyond that has some risk. Overrun. You need 4 to 1 odds against a hex occupied by 1 or more inactive player strength points. And then you may enter it by spending 1 additional movement point over and above what you would have to pay to actually enter the hex, and eliminate all the inactive players' strength points in that hex. This does not require the combat table. If the force occupies a mountain hex or is entrenched, you need 5 to 1 odds. If the moving force gets 6 to 1 odds, it can execute the overrun without expending the extra movement point. The moving force is limited in size as per normal movement rules. The total number of strength points accompanying a single leader can never exceed 10. But there's talk about army groups here. So I think you can have more than 10 or 12 strength points together. The active player may only execute an overrun with units occupying a single hex that were in supply at the start of the movement phase and are being moved together as a single group. You may use force marching for an overrun. However, an overrun may not be executed unless the moving force can expend the full movement point cost to enter the hex in which the overrun occurs. A force which executes an overrun can continue moving, can do extra overruns, and can initiate combat. Strength points inside cities cannot be overrun. During movement phase, if the inactive player's units are occupying a city hex, the active player may move units adjacent and require the inactive player to announce whether his units are within or outside the city. This is not an all-or-nothing decision. Some inactive forces can be in the city, others outside. If any inactive units remain outside, they may be overrun. However, overrun movement may not end in the city hex. I think this is limited to I don't know. A city overrun may not be executed on units unless the moving force can expend the full movement point cost to both enter and exit the hex in which the overrun occurs. So you don't have the ability to besiege the city at that point? That feels weird. We'll look into that later, but I feel because maybe overrun is maybe siege is part of combat, which means you have to be adjacent to do it. Leaders have no offensive or defensive influence on an overrun and cannot be injured, killed, or eliminated. If the leader or inactive player occupies a hex which is overrun, the leader is immediately redeployed to the nearest hex occupied by a strength point of the same color, which could jump you quite far in some cases. I'm going to stop there. I'm not feeling great. I think it's the charger that's the problem. It's kind of hanging at a weird angle. That may be the issue. I picked this camera up and it wasn't charged at all. I'm back up here because I'm forcing myself to come up to do the rules. I'm going to have to check the battery though. But, I'm falling into sort of my worst habits, which is really just sitting in front of the computer, playing my computer game, watching videos and whatnot, and wasting everything, and not getting anything done and not having a particularly good time. Like, I would have a good time sitting out on my porch, drinking and smoking a cigar and listening to music, for example. I don't know what's happened. the little charger's light was on. There's a little light there. It didn't feed into the camera, and it's because was dangling a little loose. I don't know what's up. I don't understand electrical things. I figure if the light's on, juice is going through, and it should be doing something. Apparently not enough to power the whole transformer, just a little light. Why is the light there if, it should be the last thing to go on. All right, let's look at supply. Supplies. So at various times, you have to determine your supply status. It is basically, I think it's 3 hexes. I'm looking, it doesn't really tell. So no, it's like 3 movement points. Damn it, I forgot about this coming loose. Basically, you can trace supply back to a source. And you can trace to one of your units, and that'll get you there. It has to be your own color unit, though. The sources are a major city in the home country or a satellite state of the home country of the strength points being supplied. I don't know the difference between major and minor. These are capitals. I think major cities are the red dots, minor cities are the black dots. Again, there's no key on the map. There might be, there's this, which isn't very helpful. Oh, this gives the different weather zones, 1, 2, 3, and 4. That I think is the red, I think it's that white along a national boundary. But man, there's just so much color on this map. It is not easy to cope with. And there's no fucking key here. I don't know, maybe it's on the back of some other book, but it's not in the charts and tables, which would be a stupid place for it. Where it really belongs is here on the map. But there's so much busyness everywhere that there's no room for it. Now, there would probably be room somewhere in Russia, Anyway. Very disturbing. Okay. A city designated a supply source according to the campaign itself. Some of the, that's the campaign game. GCG as opposed to SG. S being, I don't know. G being the ending doesn't make a lot of sense for these. That seems to mean rule book. I don't know why. At least one strength point which is in supply and of the same color, and you can trace through it. These are essentially the depots in the game. They do not have a limit to how much they can supply. So you can pump basically you can pump all your supply points or all your supply needs through one chain. For good or ill. You can't do that in Empires in Arms. I don't remember in that Nations in Arms. We had an example there. A unit inside a city which is a supply source for that unit is in supply, even if it's besieged, essentially. A supply line can be traced into a hex occupied by a strength point of the inactive player, but may not be passed through such a hex to a more distant hex unless the inactive player's strength points are inside the city in that hex, i.e. you're besieging them. I don't know why you'd want to trace into an enemy's hex. Oh, I know, overruns. Okay. During attrition, the attrition die roll is increased if you're out of supply. During movement, force march is increased if you were unsupplied at the start of your movement phase. If you're unsupplied at the end, you may not execute an overrun. Oh no, if supply points which were not supplied at the start may not execute an overrun. I don't know why. read something that's not there. During combat, your unsupplied strength points have their combat strength halved. You total them and then halve, rounding up. The inactive player's strength points have their full combat value during combat phase, even if unsupplied. For combat, the supply status is determined at the start of each round of combat. Now, I think they're unsupplied markers. I can't imagine what they're for. I guess it's some sort of mnemonic device. But honestly, there's no time at which you determine supply and that I can think of where you determine supply and then it has to stay in that state for, some stupid length of time where you wouldn't just remember. I mean, if you're moving a unit, you determine its supply and then you move it. And if you're in combat, you determine its supply at the moment of combat. So they kind of don't serve a purpose. I think they were in the original too, and I don't remember them having any point. Okay. Supply status is determined at the start of each round of combat because units can move around during combat. Okay, let's get the combat rules themselves. This is the heart of the game. This is where the complexity really lies in this game. You can initiate combat against a hex occupied by any strength points of the inactive player if it's directly adjacent to a hex which is occupied by at least one strength point of the active player, and those are not separated by all C. You don't need a leader. Got a little bit here for city fortifications that you can hide in or whatever. But one key issue here is if you declare combat against a hex with a city, the inactive player has to announce which of his units are inside the city at that point. The active player announces all the combats he wishes to initiate and which strength points will initiate the combat by physically indicating the hexes those strength points occupy. This is going to be a one hex attacks one hex game, situation to begin with. Now, one thing that we have that was not in the original is these little battle markers, a couple of which have boxes, the rest do not. I mean, I don't know why two would need boxes and you wouldn't need them for all of them. It's really when there's a lot that you have to worry about separating them because the combats, the combats can get quite confusing, and I'm not sure those boxes really help. And I'm not sure how much the counters help either because multiple hexes can get involved in a combat. You'll see that in a bit, but that's something new that may help a little bit. It would be useful if there were more counters for it, sort of. I don't know. I really don't know how it could be done. It's kind of a mess. It's almost like you want to be able to draw a little circle around the units that are involved in a given combat. You'll see. He also has to specify which strength points will initiate the particular combat by physically indicating the hex those strength points occupy. Yeah. You point to the attacking hex and the defending hex. Each combat's initiated separately, indicating two hexes. Yeah, we're talking a lot there. A maximum of one battle can be initiated per hex. The active player may initiate as many attacks as he desires at the start of his combat phase, but may never initiate additional attacks once the combat resolution process has begun. During combat, the active player may only resolve attacks against the hexes specified at the start of the combat phase. For each specified attack, at least one initial round of combat must be resolved. The initial round must be resolved as soon as the active player has specified all the attacks. And then after each of those has been handled, you may then initiate other rounds of combat. You initiate all the first round combats, then you can do all the second round combats, all the third round. So everywhere on the map is basically on the same days. And that's important. I mean, it's a month-long turn, but all the combats are happening at the same time. If two combats are close to each other, that can have a real effect. Okay. They all battles start on the same day, though, is essentially something to kind of remember. Okay. As unbelievable as that seems. The combat phase may consist of any number of rounds of combat. Once you initiate a combat between a hex containing your strength points and any inactive strength points, you can continue executing until either of the two original hexes is completely vacated, at which time the combat is automatically terminated. After the initial round of combat, the active player is under no obligation to continue any specific attacks, but if he ceases, the inactive player can initiate a counterattack governed by the same restrictions as an attack initiated by the active player, but resolved by the inactive player at the end of the current combat round. The inactive player can then continue attacking, and this can swing back and forth. During the initial round of combat, all strength points in each pair of hexes are automatically committed, with an exception in Siege, which is in Rulebook SG, which is this one for some reason. That doesn't have S or G in its name. At the end of the initial or any subsequent round of combat, each player may attempt to commit additional strength points to any battle according to the following restrictions. They may only be committed to a battle if they occupy a hex which is adjacent to either of the two hexes in which the battle originated. Strength points which are already committed to a battle during any round of combat must withdraw from that battle before they can be committed to a different battle. The strength points may not be besieged or demoralized. If a player wishes for the possibility of committing additional strength points to a battle, he must announce the intention aloud and physically indicate the hex these strength points occupy. After doing this, he rolls a single die, which is modified by leadership value for any single leader who's also in that hex. If the result is 5 or greater, the strength points in that hex are considered committed to the battle. This procedure is performed separately for each hex occupied by strength points he wishes to commit. A player may not attempt to commit any strength points to a battle more than once during a single round of combat. A leader does not have to be present to attempt to commit the strength points, but it can improve your odds. Every strength point committed to a particular battle must occupy a hex which is adjacent to at least one enemy strength point already committed to the same battle. If the strength points are committed, I thought it was also friendly. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. If strength points are committed in a hex adjacent to the enemy, their deployment is not altered. If strength points are committed, see here, every strength point committed to a particular battle must occupy a hex which is adjacent to at least one enemy strength point already committed to the same battle. Okay? That's rule 1. If strength points are committed in a hex adjacent to the enemy, that deployment is not altered. Fair enough. They have to be adjacent. If strength points are committed in a hex which is not directly adjacent to the enemy, that's not allowed according to the beginning. They are immediately moved to the nearest hex occupied by at least one friendly strength point which is adjacent and already committed to the same battle. Engaged units which become not adjacent to an enemy due to withdrawal and subsequent advance are immediately shifted to an adjacent hex occupied by at least one friendly strength point which is adjacent and already committed to the same battle. That may not be possible in some circumstances, but I'm very troubled by the wording of this because, first of all, it's directly contradictory. It basically says, I can't commit something to a battle unless it's adjacent to the enemy, and then says, I can be committed to a hex which is not directly adjacent to the enemy, and goes to the nearest hex occupied by at least one friendly strength point which is adjacent, which I assumed had to be adjacent as well. You had to be. So my reading of this had been that if I have a fight between these two units, I could try to commit this command and it would then enter this hex. But that's not what the beginning says. The beginning says I can't try to commit this because it's too far away. And the later part seems to indicate that maybe I could commit it if it's back here. There's all kind of weirdness here, and that's going to come into play when we take a look at this, which we're going to do right after we finish this section. I need to switch batteries, but this is the heart of what I don't get about this. And maybe they cleaned this up in the later editions, but these rules, I think, are from the original. I'm going to peek at that and make sure after I change the battery. Actually fucked up. The original rules were right, or fit my conception. Strength points may only be committed to a battle if they occupy a hex which is adjacent to either of the two hexes in which the battle originated. Strength points which are already committed during any round must withdraw from that battle before they may be committed. Okay. Which makes sense. So why was this changed? And we're going to see some reasoning behind that when we look into this. I don't know if I want to take what that is pretending because I don't have any real rules for it. The original War and Peace rules worked. I'm not sure why this was changed, but I will tell you when I looked at this, I said, you can't do that. And you'll see in a little bit. Okay. As a result of committing additional strength points to a battle after the initial round, the strength points can occupy several different hexes. This battle is treated as a single combat. You'll roll one die, you'll look up, and you'll compare the strengths for all those hexes, etc. Like I said, it can get kind of ugly theoretically. It doesn't tend to. During any one round of combat, the active player must complete all attempts to commit additional strength points before the inactive player does so. All right, let's hold off about the sequence of play and go to this operational methods booklet. So this is sort of a strategy hints type thing, or well, tactical hints. How to manipulate your men. And I'm going to jump into this because it's just wrong. We talk about the square battalion here, and it sets it up like this, with 4 units all kind of 2 hexes apart. You create them like this, you lay them out. In this case, the core is leading the way to advance. The formation enables both attack and defense. On the attack, advance placement to the enemy with first corps, that's this one, and move second and third as close as possible to this action. Okay? Move Napoleon either into the combat hex, either into the hex combat will be initiated from or just behind to act as a reinforcement. Then initiate combat. That all makes sense. On defense, the enemy in his presumed position will be able to strike either the first and second corps. Well, he could hit one of them. He can't hit both. I mean, he could from here eventually. Or first and third corps. Yeah, but he could also just hit first corps or just hit third corps if he has a lot of movement. This leaves 2 corps for reinforcement. Not necessarily. Since Napoleon is one of the available reinforcing corps, no, he's way back here. He can't reinforce shit. His leadership bonus means he will succeed in reinforcing 84% of the time. That sounds like, you know, getting a 5 with the +3. Okay. This formation also serves to reduce attrition as each hex contains fewer than 6 strength points. However, the total strength is about 100,000 men, which is quite substantial. Look, you can position this same thing by putting them all right next to each other, okay? And you get that same, you get the effect that's being described here. But this is covering more ground, which is one of the things that intrigued me about it. But it doesn't seem to work. And then here we go to Le Batalcare shift. Due to hidden movement, this game is quite possible your enemy's position will shift relative to your own. The situation has changed very little for the French force. The mutually supporting nature of this formation means it's possible to retain flexibility. So instead of the enemy being in the front, they shift to the side. And now they say in this case, second corps becomes the point. The first corps and Napoleon become the flanking corps, and the third corps becomes the reserve. Yeah, but none of them can engage if I just hit the second corps by the rules as written in the original. And as written here, there's nothing that's really clear about this 2-hex advance. And I'm wondering if what they want is to make that 2-hex advance to combat possible, even though this is actually more restrictive, where you have to actually be adjacent to at least one. Every strength point committed has to be adjacent, must occupy a hex which is adjacent to at least one enemy strength point already committed, which is worse than this was in terms of the flexibility. Maybe they meant to extend it further. And then we go into more examples, and they all seem to talk about the same kind of thing, as if that 2-hex jump is allowable. And I'm intrigued by it. But that allows a lot of movement. These hexes are not tiny, you know. So I really don't know. I really don't know. But certainly, even with this, you're not forced to attack. I mean, no matter how you form the 4 units, even if you cluster them into a tight little diamond, I can always come to an attack that's just on the point. Yes, reinforcements can come in, but I can always hit that that front unit and hit it pretty hard. There's nothing where it's like I have to hit the first and second. In fact, that's not even allowed. So I don't know. I don't know what this thing is talking about. Under any interpretation, I can't get it. I can't get what it's trying to say. But I'm tempted towards that. Let's allow you to jump 2 hexes on your reinforcement, because it feels like the bottom half of this, where was it? If strength points are committed to a hex which is not directly adjacent to the enemy, they are immediately moved to the nearest hex occupied by at least one friendly strength point which is adjacent and already committed. Nothing about, you know, only being able to move 1 hex. And to me, that the way that's worded, if it wasn't for that first part that says you have to be adjacent to enter, you know, I can jump from here to there. You know, right? If I ignore that first part of the rule, I'm torn between using the original rules and using some hybrid of what this is trying to express, which is that sort of 2-hex distance. I don't really believe that 2-hex distance, though. And I'm not really sure it gives you that much flexibility to cover that extra ground. Certainly not so much in Germany, but as you go further and further east and there's more and more space, maybe it is important. I don't know. I really don't know. You know, maybe they just got the graphics wrong and it should have been all pushed together. And for some reason made this rule absolutely much less clear than the original. All right. I'm almost out of battery here too. So I am going to hold off. Let's do the combat sequence and play. And then I'll hold off on combat resolution because I'm still not well. Okay. Here's the steps performed for combat resolution. First round of combat, you indicate that all attacks you wish to initiate by indicating the hexes and the hex performing the attack. And the samples are put here. Presumably you indicate it with these. That would make sense, but it doesn't directly tell me. The inactive player indicates whether any attacked force is located in a city or inside or outside. The active player indicates all attacks he wishes to resolve during the current round of combat. I guess you can initiate him and then back out of it after somebody, you know, indicates that they're in the city, I mean, then you can't. For each attack, the 2 dice are rolled once, and the result is obtained from the CRT. For each attack, any required loss is immediately eliminated from the forces. After all pre-designated attacks have been resolved, first the active, then the inactive player may withdraw. You might have to withdraw, depending on the rules. We're going to probably play with the option that doesn't force you to withdraw, but you probably want to. Anytime a hex is completely vacated by withdrawing force, the opposing force which participated may immediately advance into that hex. After all voluntary withdrawals have been executed, first the active, then the inactive may attempt to reinforce any force. What about involuntary withdrawals? Why is it talking about voluntary? Like, there are involuntary withdrawals as well that can be part of the base rule, that are part of the basic rules. The inactive player may attempt to reinforce any force which participated in combat during the current round. After all attempts to reinforce have been resolved, all forces which possess a current morale value of 0 must withdraw. So yes. Okay, so this is important. If you don't voluntarily, you can choose not to voluntarily withdraw if you have a 0 morale, and hope to reinforce and bring the morale up. Anyway, they have to withdraw due to specific different rules. Any possible advances must be performed along with corresponding withdrawals. They don't keep you in contact. You're not still fighting. All right. But you can enter into another combat if you move so that you're adjacent to it. We're going to hold off on combat resolution because I got to charge all these batteries now. It's just my natural unwillingness to like do things. I was either supposed to be gaming tonight or tomorrow night, starting at 9:30 p.m. I guess if it's a night and it's 9:30, it's p.m. But it's 6 a.m. in the morning. No. Hey, I haven't heard anything since, and I am just assuming it's not happening now. But that adds to my reluctance, not so much to come up here, but to do other things. All right, let's look at how combat resolution itself works. Although I think I've largely explained that in the early part. You total up your strength points of all the hexes that are involved in that particular combat. You determine odds. It is a normal odds where, you have to exceed the 2-to-1 or whatever. It does have a 3-to-2 range, but that's not hard to deal with. What's hard to deal with is when you're dealing with odds where you round up on a 0.5 and stuff like that. We saw that very recently. What the hell I was just playing? I can't even remember what I played. Oh yeah, Onward Christian Soldiers. Yeah. Those systems tend to have that. This one would be a candidate for it because you actually have... So the combat table is based, if I can ever find it, that's not it. We're getting close, but I've been through here before. This is the campaign combat table. I don't know how that's different. There's one. I mean, it's obviously different looking. Anyway, the combat table is based on larger versus smaller. So it would make sense maybe to have that, because there isn't an obvious defender advantage that you want to factor into it, to have that 0.5 or 0.25 round up. But again, it's not designed for that, so I don't think it would work properly for it. Anyway, after you determine the ratio, you roll 2 dice, and there might be modifiers. There's a whole bunch of different things. Look at. Let's see if I can find it this time. There we go. So you modify for the leadership of the leader in charge of the 2 combats. the morale of the units, possible terrain effects, and then the tactical matrix if it's in play. And then you get a result, which is expressed. A 0 does nothing to the side that takes it. A 1 or a D1 or D2 or D3, you have to look up. I actually thought, I remembered these as, that's you take a demoralize and you take a hit, but that's not the case. You look up here against the strength point of the smaller force, and that's how many losses that each side takes. And it's always based on the smaller force, which again, kind of makes sense. If the odds are 4-1 or greater, which would allow an overrun normally, the smaller force takes a D3. If it loses more than one strength point, the larger force also takes a 1 result. Leadership, you just compare the values on the leaders, and the differential is the advantage. Morale, you compare the morale values. The differential is going to be the modifier. However, the morale of a force, and I've seen this in a few things that feels really weird, as opposed to how, say, Empires in Arms or EU deal with it. The morale is the value of the largest group of strength points sharing the same morale value of the force. If a force has equal numbers of strength points of 2 or more different morale values, and it doesn't even say largest, but I think that's key, the morale of the force is automatically the lowest morale value present in the force. Now, this is really ugly, right? So instead of averaging morale and rounding or something like that, or taking the median, you're taking whatever is the largest single quantity. And in the strange effect, now here, the way it's written, let's say I have a 1 morale unit, a 0 morale unit, like a militia or something, and 4 regulars. That would give me a morale of 0 the way this is written. I'm not willing to accept that. I'm only willing to accept if it's equal numbers tied for the top, because that makes more sense. But again, I'm cheating by doing that. This is how the rules are written. Now, maybe they fixed that, but you know, it's so repulsive to me. But as it is already, this largest stack thing is kind of repulsive, because again, I could have like 4 guards, 3 regulars, 3 morale 1 miners, and 3 militia at morale 0. And there I have like 9 units with an average morale of 1 and 4 units with an average morale of 3, right? So then I'm looking at 21 divided by 13. I'm looking at a morale of around 2, but I get to use that 3 morale just because. Yeah, you could say that's kind of a minor thing. Yeah, maybe, but I just don't like it. I think it should be the median. They never do that. Anyway, terrain effects. So there's a couple of terrains that have an effect. Forest, lake, swamp, mountain, desert, or river are summarized on the terrain effects chart, which has to be over here. We're looking for something with a picture. Aha. So is this the map key? You know, it doesn't contain everything, but it has a lot of stuff on it. And then it's going to have the die roll modifiers there, and we kind of have to, yeah, mountains are nasty. Crossing a river or coming out. So actually here they have if attacked from, which makes it sounds like a 1776 river where the river's in the hex like it is here, but the rivers appear to be crossings. You would think it would be worded differently. I believe it's if attacked crossing. Okay. I wonder if the original. I thought so. On the original map, the rivers are in the middle of the hexes just like they are in 1776. And this is an artifact that carried over, probably gets cleaned up in one of the later editions. That's a pretty easy thing to clean up. But you're seeing there are problems, some of which are introduced new to this rule book, and it's kind of questionable why they would be. Like the thing that has something to do with this. First of all, this is just bullshit. I mean, it doesn't follow either the old rules or the new ones in any sense of the word. But anyway. Okay. Where are we here? We're not there. Entrenchments. They give a 1 point modifier, and this will be either plus or minus depending on if it's the larger or smaller force that's getting the advantage. Then you roll 2 dice, cumulatively modified. You redetermine them for each round of combat. We got a long example here, and then the explanation. You get a result which affects both forces. Actually, that's not true. Each side takes their own result. The L is applied to the larger force. Yeah, it's not, again, it's under the column. The die roll is found here. The results are LS with a hit. And you get a number or a letter number combination, and you look up and see how many strength points you lose based on the size of the smallest force. At least 50% of the strength points eliminated must possess the morale value used by the force during the current round of combat. You could take more. Like, for example, if you're in some kind of pathological situation where, like, you have a 0 morale, you could actually end up improving your morale by taking combat losses. At least 50% of the strength points eliminated must be the same color as the leader whose value was used. Okay, this is tricky. There's no precedence being given here. I think we'll go in order and make the morale the key one, but it is possible that the morale and the color could end up conflicting with each other. When a force takes a D, it's required to lose and is required to lose more than 1 strength point. It must lose at least 1 cav strength point if any are available in the force. Here we go. If there's a conflict as to which strength point must be eliminated, players should try to follow the rule's priority sequence. If there's more than one alternative, the decision should be made at random. Yeah. See, this seems like it applies only to the cav unit, though. So, I don't know. An unsupplied force is treated identically to a supplied force. Yeah. A force inside a city is treated identically to one outside. Okay, great. Nothing to see here. Still more nothing to see here, right? You know, if you get a D result, you're demoralized, and that demoralization marker, a D1, D2, or D3 marker, and those are here. We have D1s and D2s. I don't think there are any D3 markers. I don't remember if there were in the original. But obviously you can stack them. It's immediately placed on top of the force, and then its morale value will be reduced by that number. Of course, its morale may have gone up due to the combat or down. The effect of demoralization is cumulative. If demoralized force is again demoralized during a subsequent combat round, it gets more levels of demoralization. However, its overall morale can never be less than 0. But it'll still keep the counters. If prior to the end of the combat round a demoralized force is reinforced by an equal or greater number of undemoralized friendly strength points of any quality, the demoralization marker is removed and the force regains its normal morale value. These reinforcements may originate from more than one hex, And it doesn't have to be entering the hex, just entering the battle. This is one reason why these structures are particularly interesting, because you can take a losing round of battle and then recover from it by pushing the reinforcements into play. But you got to be sure of your leaders and whatnot. If at the end of any combat round a force committed to a field battle must withdraw if its current morale value is 0, except for with an optional rule. Fuck. This is going longer than I thought. At the end of any combat round, a force inside a city which was assaulted during the current round is eliminated if its current morale is 0. They'll be considered surrendered units during a grand campaign. We have a surrender box in here. We had it in the original. Yeah, we have prisoners. At the end of the combat phase, all the demoralization markers are removed. So they only last for the course of the combat. If all the combat units accompanying a leader are eliminated, the owning player rolls 2 dice to determine if the leader is wounded or killed. If the leader is unharmed and his force was eliminated in field battle, the leader is moved to the nearest hex containing an unbesieged unit of the same color. If the leader's force was eliminated inside a city, the leader is automatically eliminated or captured. If playing the grand campaign, captured leaders can be exchanged for other captured leaders or by any agreement which is not expressly forbidden. If a leader is moved to another hex, he may not be used to influence combat for the combat phase, because remember, all the combats are happening on the same day. Yeah, they happen in, because you do your movement first, it's kind of hard to tell. Yugos are so weird, like trying to, you can take the picture that all the combat happens after units have moved as far as they can move, if you don't have breakthroughs and stuff like that. It's the same kind of thinking. A force unable to affect a mandatory withdrawal is automatically eliminated, captured. I gotta swap batteries. Do I go on? I mean, we're almost done with the base rules, for whatever that's worth. But I think I want to go on anyway. As I'm feeling downright guilty for not doing anything, which is why I feel like I have to stick around longer than, maybe my throat wants me to. In addition, that little thing, it was not charging, and the plug was seated properly. I just had to rotate. Now that's weird. That's a different camera. That's the one that I just used for charging. It's had the issue every now and then, but not often. All right. Okay. Withdrawal, retreat, and advance after combat. At the end of each round of combat, this is done during the combat. At the end of each round of combat, immediately before attempting to commit additional strength points, each player may voluntarily withdraw any of his forces committed to a round of field battle as follows. Excuse me. If a withdrawing force does not occupy a city hex, it must retreat 1 hex in any direction, provided the withdrawal ends no further from a friendly supply source, movement points, than the hex originally occupied. If such a retreat would be impossible, the withdrawing force may move in a direction increasing the distance from a supply source by as little as possible. If a withdrawing force occupies a city hex, it can withdraw into an adjacent hex, as above, or it can retreat into the city in the hex, provided there's no enemy strength points already inside the city, owning it, and that the hex was occupied by at least 1 friendly strength point before any enemy units entered the hex. The number of strength points which may withdraw inside a city is limited by the fortress capacity for the city. A withdrawal force can be divided into different stacks, which can go in different directions. That's not charging again. Fuck. I gotta hold. What happened? I just twisted the wire, and that started it again. I think the wire untwists, and it ends up not charging because of that. Like, it rotates, and the connection with the camera itself isn't good. Okay. A force can retreat into an enemy-occupied hex if no other options are open. However, it can't end its retreat in that hex. It must continue its retreat until it enters a hex free of enemy units. It loses 1 strength point for each enemy-occupied hex it enters during its retreat. It's not allowed to overrun or anything like that. It can end its retreat inside a city, even if there are enemy strength points outside the city in the same hex. And here it says siege lines are considered porous. Look, it can still only enter the city if it fulfills the requirements that it would have before, right? It can't just like sneak into an enemy city this way, even though it's not spelled out there. A force may not retreat into a hex containing a friendly strength point currently committed to battle. If you wish to withdraw a force from one battle in order to commit it to another, you must announce you wish to withdraw. You follow normal procedure used to commit additional strength points in battle, requiring a modified die roll. If the attempt succeeds, the force may be immediately withdrawn to join the neighboring battle. If the withdrawal attempt, no, it's the reinforcement that you're rolling for, but fails, the force must remain in place and is engaged in its original battle. As an alternative, you can pull back and try to enter again in another round of battle. But if you want to do it immediately, you have to go through this and succeed in the die roll to get away. Units inside a city may never retreat into an adjacent hex. In order to retreat into an adjacent hex, a unit must be withdrawn from a field battle. Units may not retreat across all C hex sides. Exceptions. See the Denmark and Walcheren Island crossings. Okay. Denmark's are these. Walcheren Island didn't used to be on the map. I think it's this. Yep. Those are the only crossing arrows in the game. Sicily's not in the game. Morocco's not in the game. Okay, where are we? Any force which withdraws from a field battle automatically loses 1 strength point if the opposing force has more cav strength points than the force which is withdrawing. That's going to be hard to remember. I don't know why, it just is. If a withdrawing force is unsupplied, of course reminding myself makes it easier, the opposing player determines where it may retreat. He may not retreat the force into a hex his units occupy if any other hex is available. The enemy force must retreat 1 hex in any direction, subject to prior described restrictions, provided it ends its withdrawal no further from a friendly supply source. Interesting situation. You've got them cut off from supply as it is, so then therefore, and this is something the defender has to check supply for this, or the inactive player. You're able to maneuver them after the battle, which is something you wouldn't normally have as an option. Withdrawal from either of the 2 original battle marker hexes ends the battle. I didn't think that was the case. I think there's something that conflicts with that, and we'll get to that later. Consult 7NC. Okay. I don't know what the 7 is. Maybe it's the page. Now the page is 10. N, it should be N7C, which is about how you commit strength points to a battle. A little weird, but let's go back to this. For the effect of any other hex containing strength points being withdrawn from the overall force committed to the battle. Their withdrawal does not end the battle. Okay, so I think what this is saying is that anything except the original hex, even though it's fighting directly against something, it can withdraw without ending the battle. But if the original hex will end the battle. This 7NC doesn't really help much, but At the end of any round of combat, after both players have had their opportunity to commit additional strength points, a force committed to a field battle must withdraw if its current morale is 0. This is governed by land P7. Okay. P is over here. 7. Okay. It says the same exact thing and nothing more. That's great. That's not terribly helpful. Where are we? At the end of any round of combat, any unit committed to a field battle may advance into any hex in which all of the opposing strength points have either withdrawn or been eliminated by combat. The hex is completely vacated. Similarly, any unit committed to a field battle may withdraw if all opposing strength points have either withdrawn from that field battle or have been eliminated by combat. Unsupplied units are not allowed to advance after combat, not even into supply. Neither withdrawal nor advance after combat is considered regular movement. There's no movement point cost for any regular movement executed during a combat phase. For example, reinforcing units, as per 7NC, which is the correct reference here. It makes sense. But so far, we've had 2 references that aren't very helpful, and now a third one that is right. Both infantry and cavalry strength points can advance or withdraw, either with or without an accompanying leader and vice versa. This could result in a force being placed in a hex it might have been unable to reach during the preceding movement phase. Ooh. Undemoralized units which advance or withdraw after combat may be committed to any other previously initiated field battles. Now, demoralized means you have a morale of 0, not just a demoralized marker. Units which withdraw from a field battle into a city may be assaulted during subsequent combat rounds of the same combat phase. In all other cases, units which withdraw or advance after combat may not participate in any additional combat for the remainder of the combat phase. Because, so this is the thing. The only way additional units get added into a combat is through the reinforcement mechanism. They never get added, like, you can't just advance and keep hitting a unit and keep pursuing it. Which makes absolute sense. It's just, there's some weirdness there because, okay. Engaged units which become not adjacent to an enemy due to a withdrawal and subsequent advance, rule N8D. Is that what it is? Yeah. Like, there's there's very little there. It's just telling you what, that you can advance. The rules for advance are down here. I feel like the cross-referencing is a little too extreme at this point. I'm usually very much in favor of a lot of rules referencing. Here I'm looking stuff up and just saying, yeah, that doesn't give me any additional information in this direction. The other direction makes sense, and actually I'm not sure that other direction is even handled. The N7C sends me to rule Q. Is that what I'm in? Yeah, okay. I mean, it sends me to it broadly, but I'm not sure the specific was helpful. Are immediately shifted to an adjacent hex occupied by at least one friendly strength point, which is adjacent and already committed to the same field battle. So this is really weird. If you're engaged, again, I feel like some of the positioning is just done wrong. If you're engaged and you become not adjacent to an enemy, you're shifted to be adjacent to a friendly strength point, which itself is adjacent and already committed to the battle. That puts you in a position where you're kind of no longer in the battle. Again, I want to look this up in the original rules, see if it's clearer there. Because this may be clues into what the fuck that's supposed to be about, but when you reinforce into a battle, you move adjacent to the enemy, maybe into a stack with your own troops. You don't just float out there fighting. So there is no corresponding rule in the original rule book, which means this is covering a gap there. It's poorly stated, and I think I'm changing the rule, how it's worded. I'm changing it to, you have to move adjacent to the enemy, and if possible, stay adjacent to one of your friendly units. But the key here is you have to move adjacent to an enemy who's engaged in that same battle still. Because otherwise, other stuff doesn't make sense. Leader casualties. At the end of each combat phase, not round, except for, what was it? When you withdraw or whatever, you have to make a loss check, right? I don't know. If you're completely eliminated, you make one. Each player rolls 2 dice for each of his named leaders which occupied a hex in which any friendly combat strength points were committed to a battle. You can flip such vulnerable pieces upside down to indicate their susceptibility. They're kind of not telling you who they are in that case. Hopefully I won't need to do that. If the result's less than 12, the leader's fine. If you roll a 12, you roll a die again. On a 1 through 5, you're put that many months ahead on the turn record track, and that's when you'll come back. If you roll a 6, you're dead. During reinforcements, the active player may remove a leader from the current turn box and deploy it with any strength points. If it's temporarily or permanently removed from the map, you may immediately replace him with any available unnamed leader of the same color. Okay, so there are plenty, I didn't really go into these, but there are these guys who are just lettered leaders. Now, some of them are better than others. Some of them have a 1 rank. And there's no way to really represent. So if I lose a leader and he gets put on the map, I have to withdraw that thing later. We'll see this somewhere else, I think. Immediately replace them with an available unnamed leader of the same color. If all unnamed leaders of the same color are on the map, no replacement is made. They cannot be killed or injured. In the Grand Campaign, Napoleon cannot be killed but can be injured. I don't know if this was the case originally. He'll be placed 6 months in the future. It's kind of neat because the core rules, I think, use the exact same. I'm in scenarios here. Use the exact same letters. They do not have a restriction on Napoleon being killed. I don't know which way I like. I mean, obviously, look, if you're playing the Grand Campaign and you lose Napoleon in 1805, that's a real problem. But if he dies partway through, you don't know. It may cause some issues in the Grand Campaign victory conditions because they kind of, the old campaign didn't really work. The new one, I don't fully understand its victory conditions. So maybe Napoleon dying would confuse everything. I'm going to pause there because we have a fair amount left to do, and I am not feeling great. Nor do I really want to do this. Let's move on to sieges then. If you control a city, you can use that fortress capacity to shelter an equal or smaller number of friendly strength points. At the start of the scenario, you automatically control each city in your home country. Yeah, we're going to... Okay. Major cities have a 6-point supply capacity. Minor cities have 4. That's how many strength points they can hold. Ooh, there are fortress markers, which you can use. what they look like? They might be these. I think that's the only thing they can be. So these are weird. But in the old game, they had something that looked like them that didn't say anything. It just had a star on it. And they had entrenchment counters. Everything was single-sided in the original game. Everything's double-sided here, which actually may have allowed the counter mix to be a lot smaller. One of the interesting things that I didn't mention, when I got the old War and Peace, it was the biggest game I had, like in terms of counter mix by far. In fact, it may have just been the biggest game I had. I know the map is small compared to this one, but I'm just, with 4 fold-out maps, I think that's one more than Third Reich had. I think I got it before Third Reich. I probably got it before I got the third of my Central Front series games, which is probably a bigger area. I'm just thinking, I definitely got it before TSS, and that was my first real monster that I saw, even though I had played the Central Front series with 3 maps. It didn't feel like it because it was 3 little games that you could plug in together. So yeah, I think when I picked it up, it was the biggest game I had gotten. And the map, it's about it's not that much bigger than, or I don't know if it is bigger than like the Civilization map, which is definitely not as big a game in a lot of ways. Okay, anyway. During the movement phase, if you're inside the city, you may not be overrun. But you have to declare that you're inside. That can happen, when the opponent moves next to you or whatever. During combat, you cannot be attacked in a city if there's any friendly strength points remaining outside the city. In the same hex. At the start of any combat round, if you control a city, you have 2 options if your units are attacked. You can deploy your units outside, or you can put some of them up to the fortress capacity inside. The ones that are outside are vulnerable to regular combat. If all enemy strength points in a hex are inside the city, though, the attacking player can either assault the city or besiege it. If he decides to assault the city, it's just like a field battle, except the strength of the units inside the city is doubled, and the units possessing a basic morale value of 0 are considered to have a morale of 1 when inside the city, but if they get demoralized down to 0, they surrender. But it means that Landwehr and militia and whatnot can hold a city. The die roll used to resolve the assault combat is not modified by terrain or entrenchments. In order to assault the city, you have to initiate combat against the hex, not with units after an advance after combat from another hex. You may have to fight a field battle against that hex first, but once you clear them out, you can keep going. At the start of any round of combat, if all enemy strength points are inside the city, the attacking player can declare he's sieging, advance any or all of his attacking units into the hex to besiege the city. This can include units which advanced into the city hex after combat from the hex. Yeah, because nobody else is in it, but you could also just attack it from adjacent. A siege, you need a number of strength points. Let's see. The units inside a city are considered besieged if there are an equal or greater number of supplied enemy strength points which occupy the same hex. And for this, you will use these siege markers. At the end of the first combat phase in which a city is besieged, you get a 1 numerical marker, and at the end of each besieging player's combat phase, the numerical marker will be increased by 1. Immediately after placing the marker, you roll a die, and if you get less than or equal to the number on the marker, then the city surrenders and all the troops in it go over onto your surrender pile or are destroyed. While it's besieged, no units inside the city can leave the hex. No additional units may enter the city. That's weird because you are allowed to retreat into the city. Because remember, there was a statement about the besieging lines being permeable or something like that. If so, so let's keep seeing. They can, however, deploy outside the city and attempt to break the siege by initiating a field battle. If it does not eliminate the besieging force or cause it to retreat, the besieged units may only retreat back into the city and they're still besieged. If at the end of a combat phase the besieging player cannot meet the minimal strength, the siege is broken, the numerical marker is removed, and the besieging force must be withdrawn. I don't know whether or not you can enter the city. Again, we have a contradiction in the rules. I like to think you can't. Although at Sevastopol, troops did slip in. And this is an earlier period, but not so early that the siege lines were relatively heavily... I don't know. I just don't know. Anyway. It's probably not a big deal. During attrition, the active player units are inside the besieged city. The attrition die roll is increased by the number on the siege status marker. And those will be dead units, not surrenders. When a city is besieged, friendly forces can engage in combat with the besieging force. If the friendly force outside the city hex initiates combat with the besieging force, the besieged force inside the city is allowed to attempt to reinforce, as may other forces adjacent, starting on the second round of combat. If the besieged force initiates combat, the friendly force outside the city may attempt to gain reinforcements starting on the second round of combat. Actually, I would assume it can gain reinforcements in either case. The besieging force remains in the hex and receives any relevant terrain bonuses. If the besieging force withdraws or retreats, it must leave the hex. If the besieged are defeated, they fall back into the city. Entrenchments. I thought these were an option. I almost never see them. During the movement phase, you may entrench any friendly force of 3 or more strength points which remains stationary by putting an entrenchment marker. That's the big thing. You have lots of 1 strength point units that are stationary as your supply depot garrison. You don't have generally piles of troops waiting around that you're not trying to use somewhere. We shall see. But that was my memory. They put an entrenchment. This is not movement and doesn't require a leader. That's one reason you might have it. If you have a pile of troops somewhere of reinforcements and you haven't been able to get a leader to them. The 2 dice roll result used for field battle is increased. You get a 1 point modifier from it. That's in the chart. During the movement phase or combat phase, when the entrenchment force leaves the hex, the entrenchment is removed. It may not be placed in a hex that contains a major city or capital city. You know what's not clear? What if part of the force leaves? You know, like if I have 3 strength points there and I need it for my supply line, can I build the entrenchments and leave 1 strength point there? I would say sure, you know, whatever. Okay. This is a new rule, I think. Maneuver sur les derrière. I do not remember this one. Napoleon basically got a lot of success out of outflanked. Unlike in Empires in Arms, it's not an option for everyone. It's only an option for the pro-French player. Any countries that are pro-French can use this. I'm disturbed by that. Like, I don't feel like the Austrians should be particularly good at it just because they're French, but they're supporting the French. At the start of the initial round of combat only, If strength points can be committed to the battle if they occupy a hex which is adjacent to the hex containing anti-French forces in which the battle was initially initiated, and they're not adjacent to the hex containing the French forces that initiated the battle. This is a surrounding force. The strength points, i.e. there's a hex between them. This, at least. The strength points in the surrounding force may not have initiated combat with any other hex. To perform the surrounding maneuver, the pro-French player must announce his intention aloud and physically indicate he rolls a single die, which is modified by the leadership of any single leader, which also occupies the surrounding force hex. If Wellington is present in the hex being attacked, he may subtract his leadership up to the English player. If the modified roll is 5 or higher, all strength points in that hex are picked up, moved to the hex where the battle was initiated from. They're considered committed from the first round of combat and may participate in the battle normally. So far, it doesn't sound too exciting. It gets a little better. It's as if they had just moved into the hex with the other unit. So it's not something... If the surrounding force is successfully committed, though, the first round of combat gets a bonus +1 if the initiating force is the larger force, or by -1 if it's the smaller. Yeah, I remember reading this and thinking, what the fuck are they talking about? Yeah, the larger than what? This is to do with the combat results table. If you're attacking, because you will be attacking when you do this maneuver, and you are the larger force, you use the larger force column on the combat results table. And the modifiers are all positive in your favor. And that's all it's referring to. It has nothing to do with whether the reinforcing force is smaller or larger. It's that combined force. If it is the larger force, i.e. you'll be, your modifiers will be positive, the ones that are in your favor. The player may not, but when I read it, I'm just like, why does it matter that the initiating hex was bigger than the outflank? The player may not, and that's just not the case. The player may not attempt to commit more than one surrounding force in the same battle. If it's not successfully committed, it can be used as a regular reinforcement later, in which case it won't move. It'll just stay next to the enemy, which seems more valuable in some ways, except there are no zones of control. So, yeah, maybe not. All right. Cav charge, another optional rule. At the start of any round of combat, if a force possesses any cav strength points, you can announce you're committing them for a charge. Both the active and inactive players can signal a charge. The player with the larger force has the first opportunity. The 2 dice used to resolve a field battle is increased by 1 if the larger force uses, and -1 if it's smaller. What it doesn't make clear is whether both people can succeed. It says both may signal. It's kind of ambiguous on the point. I would say I'm leaning towards they both can, and I don't really care. So it's a 1-point modifier, but as far as possible, any loss the force suffers must be filled by eliminating cav strength points. All the cav must be eliminated before any infantry. And now it says ignore rule P3C. Okay. I don't know what that is. So I can't ignore it if I don't know what it is. That is the additional losses due to a cav pursuit. I would say only ignore it if the winner charged. Like, I don't know. It feels weird. Again, I think this rule was in here. Let's look. No, this one was not. The guard is in here. Yeah, so this is something new. It allows you to use cav. Cav's more, cav's not more expensive. You have less cav than you do infantry. Because remember, you're limited by the counter mix, and you're not actually limited by the quality of the troops you have. Just by, you have X number of guard, X number of cav, X number of guard cav. So yeah. Okay, the French Imperial Guard. This works, this is from the original. This works very similarly to the cav rule. However, over here, may not use this rule combined with rule W. That confused me. Does it mean I can only pick one of these for any game? I don't think so. I think it's that I can't have a cav charge and the Imperial Guard in the same round of combat. I can't apply the modifier. Okay. If a French force under Napoleon possesses any guards, the French player can announce he's committing them. It's not as good as the cav in some ways. The French force is automatically considered to possess a morale value of 3 for the current round of combat. That gives you, maybe a +1, right? I mean, probably a +1. But as far as possible, any losses the French force must be taken against guard strength points. All guards must be eliminated before any other unit. If the French force is demoralized, its morale factor is automatically reduced to 0, and they lose the battle, essentially. And then again, you can't use it with V, which is the cav charge. I've played with this rule. I don't think I've ever used it, because generally you can just arrange to take losses. Like the idea of I will lose the battle if I'm demoralized. Now what does it say? So what it says is if the French force is demoralized, its morale value is automatically reduced to 0. What that means isn't clear. What I think it means, and this is why it's not worth it, is if you take a D result. If you take a bad result in the combat, and those are pretty easy to get. If I'm at say 3-2 odds, which seems pretty good, and I'm rolling a couple of dice, if I've got a +2, I can avoid a D result. The other option is, elsewhere in the rules, demoralized means your morale is 0. And, well, if your morale is 0, it's 0. That doesn't really do anything. So basically, if the guard fails badly, it's going to break the whole army. And that feels in alignment with Waterloo. I think this is a rule you will almost never use, but there it is. Russian patriotism. This is another one that wasn't in here. The morale of any Russian infantry or cav on map 4 is increased to 3. Ooh. That's a lot. And the Cossacks remain morale 0. Oh, that was in here. Huh. Well, I think I play with it. I feel like it's a pretty hefty bonus, but I mean, when they did settle down to fight, defensively at least, I would put it to, yeah, maybe if they're on defense, the idea of them being up to 3 on an attack, that's hard to believe. But on defense, to try to, mimic how hard they held at Borodino and whatnot. Although, they did fall back eventually. It's just they fought. And you can make the same kind of argument for Wagram, So, should we make some special rule for Austria to have, a little chit that they can do that with or something? I don't know. All right. But we'll play with it because it's only on map board area 4, which I think... Whoa. That's here. It's behind the line. Maybe these are the weather lines. I don't know what this yellowish shit is. Again, there's no map key that I'm aware of. They draw these here. So 4 map areas numerically numbered, but those those align with these lines, these black lines that cut across. I don't know what's up with this, why there's like a yellow and blue. You know what I think it may be? I think oh boy, is this fucking obnoxious. I think each nationality has its own border divides on it. Except for the neutrals, which are all like these red things. And because they're all kind of different. Like this is yellow with red dashed lines. This is kind of white with red dashed lines. But this is like dark blue, and these are different dashes than are here. I really don't know. I do have to say, this map is hideous in terms of functionality. It kind of looks pretty, but yeah, it's just so much worse than the original. Anyway, let's get back to demoralized combat. At the end of any round of combat, if the morale value of a force is 0, the owning player rolls 1 die. This is decreased by the leadership value of the force. If the result is greater than 0, the owning player must eliminate the resulting number of strength points. These are considered captured, surrendered, whatever. If you use this rule, you don't have to withdraw automatically from a field battle or surrender a fortress simply because your morale value is 0. I think what's not made clear here, and maybe it's in the original, is whether, I doubt it because it is just an optional rule that's tagged in there. Yeah, it's worded exactly the same. So the question here is, let's say your morale is 0, and you want to try to bring reinforcements in. I don't think you get that automatic withdrawal for free after you fail to bring sufficient reinforcements into play to undemoralize your force. And I think that's kind of the problem, is like, I think we just get rid of that step. If you end up there and you're still demoralized, i.e. morale 0, you do have to do this die roll. You don't get an option to bail out just because the reinforcements didn't arrive. That's how I'm going to take it. I think it makes it kind of an interesting option. Then there's a fog of war. You're not allowed to look at what other people have. If you wish to overrun, you have to announce how many troops you have, and then they announce whether you can do it. Force marches, you can kind of hide the die rolls that you have because in order to, like, you know, maybe show that you're look like you have troops when you don't, look like you have don't have infantry when you have cav, shit like that. And if a player wishes to, any leaders not adjacent to an unfriendly unit may be flipped to the flag side, but if an unfriendly unit is moved next to it, it flips back over, and you know who the leader is, which feels a little weird to me. It feels like you should have a pretty good idea of the size of the enemy force, more than who's necessarily in command. I'm going to play with what I normally do, which is that I'm not really too aware of what I have. But honestly, I feel like any kind of fog of war rule that I play with results in knowing far too little, mainly because I walk away and stuff. So mistakes will happen. That's life. You know, I won't necessarily be optimizing my attacks or whatever, but you can't really do that in this game, although odds are important to some extent. But that's the thing. This way I won't be, you know, calculating out odds factors ahead of time or anything like that. But, you know, when I'm thinking about fog of war, I think about like Vietnam, where one side is completely face down, and you have no idea what any of the stuff is, and there's lots of pieces. And I feel like I have much less idea of where the enemy is because of my walking away than I would if I were playing the game and focusing on an opponent. So actually, Fog of War rules, work far too effectively on me as a solo player compared to when I'm playing opposed. But I don't know. I also feel like most Fog of War rules, like this one, I know there's a something moving around because I see this. But I don't know who it is, and I don't know how many troops he has. I don't care who it is. Maybe I can figure that out, maybe I can't. Here it's like you're adjacent, you know who it is. But I'll tell you this much. I can tell the difference, at engagement range of whether I'm facing, a corps or half a division, or whatever. It's very, very clear what size force you're facing. And I just feel like the use of these kind of things and dummies moving around and stuff, because you'd have them. You could move leaders around with nothing and make them seem like they're troops. And, look, at 2 hexes, maybe I don't know shit because the hexes are pretty big. But at 1 hex distance where I'm in engagement range, before I make the decision to engage, I'm going to have a fair idea of the forces I'm facing. I probably don't know the exact odds, but I have an idea. Is this a force that's much, much smaller than mine? Shit like that. Anyway, that's the rules. We will add another little rules addendum for the Grand Campaign scenario, because that is its own rule book, and it is there are some significant differences from the original game there. For the most part, this is the original game, except where they kind of butchered things. And I don't know what the intention with the butchery is, because I've got this confusion. I've got absolutely contradictory rules on how reinforcements work. Right? One of them, in some places it seems like I don't have to be adjacent. In some cases, I have to be you can't do it unless you're adjacent to the enemy. In others, you have to be. It was absolutely clear here. It's not here. And then there's this, which doesn't match anything reasonable that I can come up with, except you're allowed to reinforce from 2 hexes, which there's nothing to indicate that. And it's this particular part. It is the more, tactical, operational level of this game that drew me to it, or drew me back to it, before I picked up this version, back with the old one, that drew me back to it in thoughts of, I'm thinking War and Peace might be the better game in some ways than Empires in Arms, except that the campaign in War and Peace is broken. But in terms of handling the manipulation of the troops and everything, the fact that it can handle these attempts to outflank and all that, although the rule for, kind of managing an outflank seems so minimal compared to what Empires in Arms does to you if somebody manages to outflank you successfully. And being flanked by opposing units, actually manipulating and bringing reinforcements in on the second round or whatever from a different direction, doesn't do shit in this game. It's you've got to have them surrounded, a la Nations in Arms, in order to really hammer someone. So again, I'm not really convinced by it from my read through right now, but we'll see how it plays out. The big thing I'm most interested in about this is the great flaw in the old War and Peace, which was the campaign game just didn't work. The victory conditions were fucking weird. They were simple, but they didn't work. All right. Up it goes.